Desmond stared at the hospital ceiling tiles, counting the tiny perforations while his mother's voice crackled through his phone. "She is stable now," Mama said, her English careful and measured despite 20 years in America. "But Aduni keeps asking for you." The fluorescent lights hummed above him, casting everything in stark white as he processed the news about his younger sister's suicide attempt. He had been in the graduate library when his phone buzzed with 17 missed calls. Now, sitting in the waiting room of University Hospital 3 states away from home, Desmond felt the familiar weight of being the responsible one, the older brother who had moved away for his PhD in chemical engineering. The guilt settled in his chest like a stone. How had he missed the signs? Aduni's increasingly sparse texts, her withdrawal from their weekly video calls, the way she'd grown quiet when he'd excitedly shared news about his research breakthroughs. The night stretched ahead of him, filled with the antiseptic smell of hospital corridors and the distant beeping of machines. Desmond closed his eyes and tried to remember the last time he'd really listened to his sister, not just heard her words, but truly listened. The realization that he couldn't pinpoint such a moment made his stomach turn. Tomorrow, he would drive home to Chicago, but tonight, he sat with the crushing understanding that distance was more than miles. The drive to Chicago felt endless, Interstate 80 stretching before Desmond like a ribbon of regret. He'd called his advisor, Dr. Martinez, explaining the family emergency with a voice that didn't sound like his own. The cornfields of Iowa blurred past his Honda Civic's windows as he replayed conversations with Aduni, searching for clues he'd missed. His sister had always been the quieter one, content to live in his academic shadow. But when had quiet become concerning silence? Pulling into the familiar driveway of their family's South Side home, Desmond felt the weight of childhood memories mixed with present dread. The house looked smaller somehow, the paint more faded than he remembered. His mother appeared at the front door before he could knock, her usually perfect head wrap slightly askew, exhaustion etched in the lines around her eyes. "She is sleeping now," Mama whispered, pulling him into an embrace that smelled of shea butter and worry. Inside, the house felt different, charged with an electricity of almost loss. Family photos lined the hallway, chronicling their journey from Lagos to Chicago, from wide-eyed immigrants to naturalized citizens. But now, those images felt like evidence of dreams deferred, sacrifices that might not have been worth the cost. Desmond's father sat at the kitchen table, his usually animated hands still as he stared into a cup of tea that had long grown cold. "We should have seen," Papa said without looking up, his Igbo accent thicker with emotion. Aduni looked fragile against the white hospital sheets, her natural hair spread across the pillow like a dark halo. The bandages on her wrists were discreet but unmistakable, and Desmond had to steady himself against the doorframe before entering. She turned toward him with eyes that held too much knowledge for someone who had just turned 19, and managed a weak smile that broke his heart. "Big brother came home," she whispered, her voice hoarse from the intubation. Desmond pulled the plastic chair closer to her bed, fighting the urge to lecture her about throwing away the opportunities their parents had sacrificed to provide. Instead, he took her hand, carefully, mindful of the IV lines, and simply sat with her in the steady rhythm of hospital sounds. They didn't speak for a long time, but gradually Aduni began to talk about the pressure she felt to be perfect, to honor their parents' dreams, to somehow justify the struggles of immigration. "Everyone expects us to be grateful all the time," she said, staring at the ceiling. "But what if I don't want to be a doctor or engineer? What if I don't want to prove that Africans are model minorities?" Her words hung in the air like an indictment, and Desmond realized that his little sister had been carrying burdens he'd been too busy with his own ambitions to notice. The success he'd been so proud of, first-generation college graduate, PhD candidate, research assistant, suddenly felt hollow in the face of his sister's pain. 3 weeks later, Desmond returned to Penn State with Aduni stable, but his world fundamentally shifted. The familiar campus looked different through the lens of almost loss, and he found himself unable to concentrate on his research on polymer synthesis. His advisor, Dr. Martinez, granted him an extension on his thesis proposal, but Desmond could see the concern in her eyes as he struggled through meetings and lab work. His apartment near campus felt too quiet, too sterile compared to the emotional chaos of home. He called Aduni every evening, their conversations a lifeline that kept him tethered to what mattered. She was seeing a therapist now, slowly working through the depression and cultural expectations that had nearly cost her everything. "I'm starting to paint again," she told him one Thursday night, her voice stronger than it had been in months. "Remember how I used to paint portraits of our neighbors in Lagos?" The mention of Lagos stirred something in Desmond. Memories of red earth, the sound of generators humming through power outages, the way their grandmother would tell stories on the veranda while braiding Aduni's hair. They had been so eager to become American, to shed their accents and fit in, that perhaps they had lost something essential in the translation. That night, Desmond lay awake thinking about identity and belonging, about the space between two worlds that immigrants occupied, never fully here nor there. It was at a graduate student mixer in the HUB that Desmond first saw Maya Washington, and something in his chest shifted like tectonic plates realigning. She stood near the coffee station, laughing at something her friend had said, her curly hair catching the overhead lights. She was tall, with light brown skin that suggested a mixed heritage, wearing a vintage leather jacket over dark jeans that made her look effortlessly confident. When their eyes met across the crowded room, Maya raised her coffee cup in a mock toast, and despite everything weighing on his heart, Desmond found himself smiling for the first time in weeks. He made his way through clusters of graduate students discussing research projects and teaching loads, introducing himself with an awkwardness that felt both embarrassing and authentic. "Maya," she said, shaking his hand with a firm grip. "English literature, with a focus on post-colonial narratives." They spent the next hour talking about everything except their research. Her childhood in Seattle, his journey from Lagos to Chicago, the way American universities felt like elaborate performances of intellectualism. Maya had an easy laugh and asked questions that suggested she was actually listening, not just waiting for her turn to speak. When she mentioned that her father was African American and her mother was white, Desmond felt an unexpected kinship, recognizing in her the familiar navigation of multiple identities. By the end of the evening, they had exchanged numbers and tentative plans for coffee. Their first official date was at a small cafe downtown, where Maya ordered Ethiopian coffee and Desmond chose tea, a habit from childhood that had persisted despite years in America. She wore a sundress that brought out the green flecks in her hazel eyes, and when she smiled, Desmond forgot about thesis deadlines and family obligations for entire minutes at a time. They talked about books. She was passionate about authors like Chimamanda Ngozi Adichie and Zadie Smith, writers who explored the immigrant experience with nuance and humor. "I've been reading Americana," Maya said, stirring honey into her coffee. "The way Adichie writes about code switching, about becoming American versus being American, it resonated with me, though obviously my experience is different." Desmond found himself opening up about his own struggles with identity, about feeling simultaneously grateful for American opportunities and guilty about leaving Nigerian traditions behind. As autumn settled over State College, their relationship deepened with the changing leaves. Maya would study in his apartment while he worked on lab reports, her presence a comfort that made his space feel less lonely. She had a way of asking about Aduni that felt caring rather than intrusive, and gradually Desmond began sharing the weight of his guilt and worry. "You can't save everyone," Maya said one October evening, looking up from her laptop where she was working on a paper about diaspora literature. "But you can be present for the people you love." Her words planted seeds in his mind about healing and responsibility. Desmond brought Maya home for Thanksgiving, a decision that filled him with equal parts excitement and anxiety. His mother had been polite but reserved on the phone when he'd mentioned his girlfriend, asking careful questions about Maya's background that felt loaded with unspoken concerns. The drive to Chicago was filled with Maya's nervous chatter about meeting parents and Desmond's warnings about his family's protective nature. The dinner was a careful dance of cultural diplomacy. Mama had prepared jollof rice alongside turkey, a fusion that felt symbolic of their family's ongoing negotiation between Nigerian and American traditions. Maya complimented the food genuinely, asking questions about spices and cooking techniques that seemed to thaw some of his mother's initial coldness. Aduni, home from her first semester at community college, connected immediately with Maya over art and books, their conversation flowing naturally across topics. The dinner was a careful dance of cultural diplomacy. Mama had prepared jollof rice alongside turkey, a fusion that felt symbolic of their family's ongoing negotiation between Nigerian and American traditions. Maya complimented the food genuinely, asking questions about spices and cooking techniques that seemed to thaw some of his mother's initial coldness. Aduni, home from her first semester at community college, connected immediately with Maya over art and books, their conversation flowing naturally across topics. December in Pennsylvania was brutal, the kind of cold that made Desmond long for Lagos's perpetual warmth. His research was progressing slowly, the polymer samples stubbornly refusing to behave according to theoretical predictions. Dr. Martinez suggested he take a break over winter break, perhaps gain some perspective on both his work and his personal life. The suggestion felt like a gentle dismissal of his recent scattered focus. Maya had gone home to Seattle for the holidays, leaving Desmond with too much time to think. His apartment felt cavernous without her presence, and he found himself calling Aduni more frequently, their conversations an anchor in the loneliness. She was doing better. Therapy was helping, and she'd started a part-time job at an art supply store that seemed to energize her. "I'm thinking about applying to art school," she confessed during one late-night call. "Not the kind Papa wants me to attend, but actual art school." The idea terrified and excited Desmond in equal measure. Aduni pursuing art would be another departure from their parents' carefully laid plans for their children's success. Yet he remembered the happiness in her voice when she talked about painting, the way creativity seemed to heal something in her that traditional achievements couldn't touch. When he shared this conversation with Maya via text, she responded immediately. She needs to follow her passion. That's how healing happens. Her words made him wonder about his own passions, whether chemical engineering was truly his calling or simply the safe path. Maya returned from Seattle with stories about her mixed-race cousins and a renewed energy that infected Desmond's winter doldrums. They spent New Year's Eve in his apartment, cooking together and talking about their hopes for the coming year. She made a curry that blended her mother's Pacific Northwest influences with spices she'd learned to love from him, and the fusion felt like a metaphor for their relationship. "I want to be more intentional this year," Maya said as midnight approached, wine making her philosophical. "About my relationships, my work, my understanding of who I am." They kissed at midnight, and Desmond felt something shift inside him, a resolution to be more present, more honest about his feelings and fears. He told her about his struggle with his research, his concern about meeting his family's expectations, his guilt about Aduni's struggles. January brought new challenges and opportunities. Desmond changed his research focus slightly, exploring biomaterials with medical applications, work that felt more meaningful than abstract polymer theory. Maya encouraged this shift, helping him see that following his instincts didn't constitute failure. She was also making changes, switching her dissertation focus to contemporary African diaspora literature, work that seemed to energize her scholarly passion. They were both learning to trust themselves more, to see uncertainty as possibility rather than failure. As spring arrived in Pennsylvania, Desmond felt something loosening in his chest. Aduni had been accepted to the Art Institute of Chicago, a decision that had caused family arguments but ultimately united his parents in proud support. "She is finding her way," Mama had said during their last phone call, and Desmond heard acceptance in her voice that hadn't been there months earlier. His research was finally showing promising results, the biomaterials responding better than expected to various stress tests. Dr. Martinez seemed pleased with his progress, and there was talk of presenting his work at a national conference. Maya celebrated by cooking dinner in his apartment, candles and wine transforming his utilitarian space into something romantic. "I'm proud of you," she said, raising her glass in a toast. "Not just for the research, but for everything. How you've handled this year, how you've grown." They had been together for 6 months now, and their relationship had found a rhythm that felt natural and sustainable. Maya had started spending weekends at his place regularly, her books and coffee mugs gradually claiming space alongside his engineering texts and lab equipment. They talked about the future in tentative terms, potential postdoc positions, academic job markets, the possibility of building something together. But underneath these practical conversations, deeper questions lingered about commitment, family acceptance, and what love looked like across cultural divides. In April, Desmond's parents visited State College for the first time, a trip that had been planned for months with military precision. Maya helped him clean his apartment thoroughly, stock the refrigerator with familiar foods, and prepare mentally for the intensive evaluation he knew was coming. When his parents arrived, Mama immediately began rearranging his kitchen while Papa inspected his bookshelves, nodding approvingly at the mix of technical journals and Nigerian literature. The weekend was a delicate balance of showing off his academic progress while managing his parents' expectations about Maya. They attended his research presentation together, his family sitting in the front row with visible pride as he explained his biomaterials work to a room full of professors and graduate students. Maya beamed from the audience, and afterward his father shook hands with Dr. Martinez with the gravity of a diplomatic meeting. Dinner at a local restaurant became an intercultural negotiation, with Maya asking thoughtful questions about Nigerian politics and his parents gradually warming to her intelligence and respect for their heritage. But later, in his apartment, Papa pulled him aside for a serious conversation. "She is a good girl," he acknowledged, "but have you thought about the future? About children? About maintaining our culture?" The questions hung heavy in the air, representing years of immigrant parents' careful planning and sacrifice. Desmond promised to think seriously about these concerns, but privately wondered whether love shouldn't transcend such calculations. May brought the intensity of thesis writing and dissertation proposals, and Desmond found himself spending 12-hour days in the lab and library. Maya was equally buried in her own research, working on a chapter about identity formation in contemporary Nigerian-American literature that seemed to parallel their relationship in uncomfortable ways. They passed each other like ships in the academic night, stealing moments for quick dinners and abbreviated conversations. The pressure was affecting both of them differently. Desmond threw himself into work with single-minded focus, using research as a shield against emotional complexity. Maya, meanwhile, seemed to be processing their relationship through her academic work, analyzing patterns of cultural assimilation and romantic partnerships with an objectivity that sometimes made Desmond uncomfortable. "Are we becoming a case study?" he asked one evening, finding her making notes about their dinner conversation. Their first real fight erupted over something trivial, whose turn it was to buy groceries, but escalated into deeper frustrations about time, attention, and future planning. Maya accused him of using work to avoid difficult conversations. Desmond countered that she was overanalyzing their relationship to death. They spent a week barely speaking, both too proud and too stressed to apologize first. The distance felt disproportionate to the original conflict, revealing underlying tensions about commitment and cultural expectations that neither had wanted to address directly. The reconciliation came through Aduni, who called Desmond in tears about a particularly brutal critique of her portfolio at art school. As he comforted his sister over the phone, Maya appeared at his apartment with takeout from their favorite Thai restaurant and a peace offering of his preferred green tea. She had heard him talking through the thin walls and recognized the family crisis tone in his voice. "I'm sorry," they both said simultaneously, then laughed at the awkwardness of synchronized apologies. Over pad thai and spring rolls, they talked honestly about the pressures they were both feeling: academic, familial, relational. Maya admitted that her research about diaspora relationships was making her hyper-aware of every dynamic between them. Desmond acknowledged that he had been using work to avoid conversations about their future because the questions felt too large and consequential. They established new ground rules: dedicated time for each other without academic distractions, honest communication about family pressures, and an agreement to address conflicts before they festered into week-long silences. The conversation felt like a maturation of their relationship, moving from the easy early stages into something more intentional and sustainable. That night, as Maya fell asleep in his arms, Desmond felt a settledness that suggested they were building something real together. As the semester ended, Desmond faced a decision about summer plans. Dr. Martinez had arranged a research opportunity at a pharmaceutical company in New Jersey, excellent for his career, but requiring 3 months apart from Maya, who had been accepted to a literary research program in London. The practical choice was clear, but the emotional cost felt significant after their recent struggles with distance and communication. They spent hours discussing the pros and cons, weighing career advancement against relationship maintenance with the seriousness of diplomats negotiating treaties. Maya encouraged him to take the industry position, arguing that they were both young and needed to pursue opportunities fearlessly. If we're meant to work long-term, we can handle 3 months apart, she said. But Desmond detected uncertainty beneath her confident words. The night before their departures, they made love with an intensity that felt like a promise and a goodbye simultaneously. Desmond memorized the way Maya's hair spread across his pillow, the sound of her laugh when he tickled her ribs, the serious expression she wore when she was thinking deeply. They promised to video call twice weekly, to write actual letters like characters in novels, to trust each other across the distance. But as he drove her to the airport the next morning, Desmond felt a foreboding that rational planning couldn't dispel. The pharmaceutical company in Princeton felt like a different universe from academic research. Desmond's project involved developing drug delivery systems using the biomaterials from his thesis work, applications that could potentially help millions of patients. The work was engaging and well-funded, with resources he could never access in his university lab. But the corporate environment felt strange after years in the collaborative chaos of graduate school. His colleagues were mostly other graduate students and postdocs doing summer internships, and he found himself missing the diversity of perspectives that Maya had brought to his daily life. Video calls with her in London were complicated by time zone differences and the exhaustion of 12-hour lab days. She was thriving in her research program, working with manuscripts at the British Library and presenting papers at conferences across Europe. Her enthusiasm was infectious, but also emphasized their diverging paths. Loneliness settled over Desmond like humidity, persistent and uncomfortable. He called Aduni more frequently, their conversations a bridge to familiar emotional territory. She was loving art school, finally finding peers who understood creative passion, but she also shared his concerns about cultural expectations and family approval. "Sometimes I feel like we're both disappointing them by following our hearts," she said during one late-night call. The comment stayed with Desmond, making him question whether success and happiness were necessarily aligned. Maya's letters arrived sporadically, handwritten on hotel stationery and postcards from museums, each one a small masterpiece of observation and affection. She wrote about Nigerian authors she was discovering in London archives, about conversations with other scholars that were reshaping her dissertation focus. Her intellectual excitement leaped off the pages, making Desmond simultaneously proud of her and aware of his own professional stagnation. "I met Chimamanda at a reading last week," Maya wrote in July. "She signed my copy of Half of a Yellow Sun, and we talked briefly about the way second-generation immigrants navigate identity differently than their parents. It made me think about you and Aduni, about the unique pressures of honoring your parents' sacrifices while forging your own paths." The letter was filled with insights about his family dynamics that felt both perceptive and slightly invasive. Desmond's own letters felt mundane by comparison. Updates about lab results, complaints about corporate bureaucracy, descriptions of his lonely Princeton apartment. He tried to match Maya's intellectual engagement, but found himself writing more about missing her than about personal growth or professional insights. The asymmetry in their correspondence began to worry him, suggesting perhaps that she was changing more rapidly than he was, growing in ways that might eventually outpace their relationship. As summer waned, Desmond's research project reached crucial testing phases that required 16-hour days and weekend work. The company was impressed with his results and hinted at potential full-time offers after graduation, opportunities that would pay significantly more than academic positions but require abandoning his PhD program. The choice felt momentous: security and financial success versus intellectual freedom and research passion. Maya's letters had become less frequent, and their video calls often ended with frustration about poor connections or scheduling conflicts. During one particularly difficult call, where her image kept freezing and her voice cut out, Desmond wondered if the technical problems were metaphorical. When they finally connected clearly, Maya seemed distant, preoccupied with her research and the London social scene she was growing to love. "I've been thinking about extending my stay," Maya mentioned casually near the end of their conversation. "There's an opportunity to work with a professor here on a collaborative project between British and American universities." The news hit Desmond like a physical blow, though he tried to keep his voice neutral as he encouraged her to explore the opportunity. After they hung up, he sat in his empty apartment wondering if their relationship was slowly dissolving across the Atlantic distance. September's return to campus felt like stepping back into a life that no longer fit properly. Desmond's apartment looked unchanged, but everything felt different. Smaller, quieter, charged with the absence of Maya's presence. She had decided to extend her London stay through December, a decision that made practical sense for her research but left their relationship in limbo. His classmates seemed younger somehow, their concerns about coursework and qualifying exams trivial compared to the professional and personal questions he was wrestling with. Dr. Martinez welcomed him back with enthusiasm about his summer research, but also noticed his distracted demeanor during lab meetings. Industrial experience changes people, she observed. The question is whether it's changed you in ways that align with your long-term goals. Aduni was thriving in her second year of art school, her paintings becoming more sophisticated and emotionally complex. During their weekly calls, she seemed happier and more confident than she had in years, but she also noticed Desmond's subdued mood. "Are you okay, big brother?" she asked one evening. "You sound like you did right after—" She didn't finish the sentence, but they both knew she meant after her hospitalization. The comparison worried Desmond more than he wanted to admit. The conversation with Maya about their relationship's future happened on a gray October afternoon, both of them tired and stressed from their respective academic pressures. Maya appeared on his laptop screen with London's autumn light filtering through her apartment window, looking beautiful but somehow unreachable. They tried to discuss practical matters, when she would return, what would happen after graduation, but kept circling around deeper questions neither wanted to voice directly. "I love you," Maya said, "but I'm not sure we want the same things anymore." Her honesty was both brutal and necessary. Desmond had been thinking similar thoughts, but hadn't found the courage to articulate them. The 3 months apart had revealed differences in their ambitions and priorities that proximity had previously obscured. Maya was thriving in international academic circles. Desmond was drawn to practical applications and eventual financial stability. They talked for 2 hours, crying intermittently, and trying to map a path forward that honored both their relationship and their individual growth. The conversation ended without resolution, both agreeing to think more deeply about what they actually wanted from life and love. After Maya signed off, Desmond sat in the silence of his apartment, feeling simultaneously relieved and devastated that they had finally acknowledged the growing distance between them. They talked for 2 hours, crying intermittently, and trying to map a path forward that honored both their relationship and their individual growth. The conversation ended without resolution, both agreeing to think more deeply about what they actually wanted from life and love. After Maya signed off, Desmond sat in the silence of his apartment, feeling simultaneously relieved and devastated that they had finally acknowledged the growing distance between them. The conversation with Papa happened in the garage, where his father was organizing tools with methodical precision. "Son," Papa said without looking up from his workbench, "you cannot control other people's choices, only your response to them." The comment seemed to encompass both Maya's extended absence and larger questions about life direction. They talked about duty versus desire, about building security versus following passion, about the particular pressures faced by children of immigrants. Aduni cornered him after dinner, direct in the way only sisters could be. "You're miserable," she observed, "and it's not just about Maya." She was right, of course. The relationship uncertainty was compounded by career confusion and a general sense that he was drifting rather than actively choosing his path. "Maybe you need to figure out what you want before you can figure out what you want with someone else," Aduni suggested, her wisdom startling from someone who had been in crisis just 2 years earlier. Maya returned from London in mid-December, tanned despite the British winter and full of stories about her research discoveries. They met for coffee at their old cafe, the familiarity of the setting contrasting sharply with how different they both seemed. Maya looked more sophisticated somehow. Her hair was shorter, her clothes more European in style, her conversation peppered with references to London friends and experiences. The reunion was awkward in ways that their early relationship had never been. They were both trying too hard to recreate their previous intimacy, but the effort itself highlighted how much had changed. Maya talked enthusiastically about her research, about potential postdoc opportunities in Europe, about the international academic community she had discovered. Desmond listened, genuinely proud of her accomplishments, but also aware that her excitement was for a life that didn't seem to include him. They spent a careful week together, sleeping in the same bed but feeling like strangers, making love that was tender but somehow final. On New Year's Eve, sitting in his apartment with takeout Chinese food and a bottle of wine, they finally acknowledged what they had both been avoiding. I think we need to take a break, Maya said, her voice gentle but firm. The mutual agreement was both devastating and relieving, allowing them both to stop pretending that distance hadn't fundamentally changed their connection. Spring semester began with Desmond single for the first time in over a year, a status that felt both liberating and terrifying. He threw himself into research with renewed focus, finding that without the emotional complexity of a long-distance relationship, he could concentrate more fully on his biomaterials work. Dr. Martinez noticed the change immediately, commenting that his lab results were showing remarkable improvement. The pharmaceutical company had made him a formal job offer, complete with signing bonus and relocation assistance to Princeton. The salary was more than his parents had ever dreamed possible when they first arrived in America, representing the kind of immigrant success story that justified years of sacrifice. But accepting would mean abandoning his PhD program just months before completion, a decision that felt like betraying his academic identity. Aduni had started dating someone, a fellow art student named Marcus, who made her laugh in ways Desmond hadn't heard since before her crisis. During their weekly calls, she seemed lighter, more playful, but also more mature in her understanding of relationships and personal growth. "You don't have to choose between security and passion," she told him when he mentioned his job dilemma. "But you do have to choose what kind of person you want to become." April brought the final push toward thesis defense and PhD completion, a process that consumed Desmond's days and invaded his dreams. His biomaterials research had exceeded all expectations, with potential applications in cancer treatment and wound healing that could genuinely improve lives. Dr. Martinez was encouraging him to consider academic positions, hinting that his work could lead to prestigious postdoc opportunities and eventual professorship. The choice between industrial and academic careers felt like choosing between two different versions of himself. The pharmaceutical job offered financial security and immediate practical impact, but academic research provided intellectual freedom and the possibility of groundbreaking discoveries. His parents favored the corporate position, seeing it as validation of their American gamble, while his professors pushed toward academic achievement. Maya had accepted a postdoc position at Oxford, an opportunity that would launch her into international scholarly circles. They had maintained friendly but distant contact, exchanging congratulations on professional achievements without discussing personal feelings. Her success made Desmond proud and wistful simultaneously, wondering what their relationship might have become if they had wanted the same things. Her departure for England was scheduled for August, making their breakup feel permanent in ways it hadn't before. The thesis defense took place on a humid May afternoon, with Desmond's committee asking probing questions about his biomaterials research for nearly 3 hours. His parents sat in the back row, Papa in his best suit and Mama wearing the traditional wrapper she reserved for special occasions. Aduni had driven up from Chicago with Marcus, both of them beaming with pride as Desmond explained complex molecular interactions to professors who nodded approvingly. Dr. Martinez introduced him as Dr. Okafor for the first time after the successful defense, and the title felt both earned and surreal. His parents' joy was overwhelming. Papa actually cried during the celebration dinner, talking about how their son had achieved what they had only dreamed possible when they left Lagos 25 years earlier. The moment felt like the culmination of a family journey rather than just personal achievement. But underneath the celebration, Desmond felt a restlessness that success hadn't satisfied. He had proven himself academically and professionally, met his family's expectations, and positioned himself for financial security. Yet something essential felt missing, a sense of purpose that transcended achievement. That night, lying in his apartment surrounded by packing boxes, he wondered if completion should feel more fulfilling than it did. The summer after graduation passed in a blur of job preparation and family celebrations. Desmond had accepted the pharmaceutical position, reasoning that he could always return to academic research later in his career. The signing bonus allowed him to pay off his student loans immediately and send money to his parents, gestures that felt like honoring their sacrifices in concrete ways. Aduni's art was beginning to gain recognition, with a local gallery showing interest in her portrait series exploring Nigerian-American identity. Her work captured something Desmond recognized but couldn't articulate: the way immigrants' children carried multiple selves, shifting between worlds with practice that looked effortless, but required constant internal negotiation. Her paintings were selling, providing validation that artistic passion could sustain more than just the soul. Maya had already moved to London, sending occasional updates about her research and new life. Her social media posts showed her at conferences and cultural events, looking confident and international in ways that made Desmond happy for her and melancholy for what they had lost. He was dating casually, a few dinner dates with women from work, but nothing that approached the intensity of what he had shared with Maya. Part of him wondered if he was avoiding deeper connections or if he simply hadn't met the right person yet. The pharmaceutical company welcomed Desmond with efficiency and enthusiasm, assigning him to a team developing targeted cancer therapies using advanced biomaterials. The work was intellectually challenging and potentially life-saving, but the corporate environment felt sterile compared to academic collaboration. His colleagues were brilliant and dedicated, but conversations rarely strayed beyond project parameters and performance metrics. Princeton was pleasant enough, tree-lined streets, good restaurants, proximity to New York City, but Desmond felt unmoored without the familiar rhythms of university life. His apartment was nicer than anywhere he had ever lived, but it felt more like an upscale hotel than a home. He missed the casual, intellectual debates of graduate school, the way ideas could be explored for their own sake rather than their commercial applications. The money was undeniably transformative. For the first time in his life, Desmond could afford to travel, to eat well, to buy gifts for his family without calculating the impact on his budget. He sent his parents on a vacation to Nigeria, their first return visit since immigration, and covered Aduni's art school tuition so she could focus on her work without financial stress. These generosities felt meaningful, but they also highlighted how much of his identity had been tied to financial struggle and uncertainty. The call came on a Thursday evening in November, Papa's voice tight with excitement and concern. "Desmond, we have news," he said without preamble. "Your grandmother is very sick, and she wants to see her American grandchildren before—" He didn't finish the sentence, but the implication was clear. Mama Ni, his father's mother who had raised Papa after his parents died, was dying and wanted to meet the grandchildren she had never seen. The logistics were complicated. Visa applications, work leave requests, travel arrangements to Lagos for 3 adults who hadn't been back to Nigeria in years. But within 2 weeks, they had managed to organize a family trip for January, using some of Desmond's accumulated vacation time and his parents' savings. Aduni was nervous but excited about seeing the country of their birth. Desmond felt a mixture of anticipation and anxiety about returning to a place he remembered only in fragments. The conversation also included an unexpected suggestion from Mama. "Why don't you ask Maya to come with us? She is family too, and perhaps this trip could help you both understand what matters most." The idea was both appealing and terrifying. Sharing such an intimate family experience with someone who was no longer quite family but remained important to his heart. Calling Maya felt like reopening a wound that had finally begun to heal. Her voice was warm but cautious when she answered, clearly surprised to hear from him after months of minimal contact. When Desmond explained about his grandmother's illness and his mother's invitation, Maya was quiet for a long moment before responding. "That's incredibly generous of your family," she said. "But are you sure it's wise? We're in different places now, literally and figuratively." The conversation stretched across an hour, both of them dancing around deeper feelings while discussing practical concerns. Maya was thriving at Oxford, her research gaining international attention, but she admitted to feeling homesick for America and curious about Nigeria in ways her academic work hadn't satisfied. "I've been writing about diaspora identity for years," she said, "but I've never actually experienced the homeland return journey that features so prominently in the literature." After much discussion, Maya agreed to consider the trip, promising to think seriously about whether she could take time away from her research and whether emotional reconnection was healthy for either of them. Desmond ended the call feeling simultaneously hopeful and anxious, wondering if he was trying to recapture something that was genuinely gone, or if some connections transcended the neat categories of past and present relationships. December passed in a whirlwind of travel preparations and family excitement. Maya had decided to join them, taking a sabbatical from Oxford to experience Nigeria, and she admitted privately to Desmond to explore what remained between them in a setting removed from their usual contexts. The flight arrangements were complex, Maya flying from London, the family from Chicago and Princeton, but they would all meet in Lagos on New Year's Day. Aduni was painting furiously, trying to complete a series before the trip that she planned to photograph alongside Nigerian landscapes for a new project exploring inherited memory and cultural reconnection. Her excitement was infectious, making Desmond realize how much they had all sacrificed by becoming so thoroughly American that they had lost touch with their origins. Papa was nervous in ways Desmond hadn't seen since their early immigration days, constantly checking visa documents and making lists of gifts to bring for relatives they hadn't seen in decades. Mama was coordinating with family members in Lagos, arranging accommodations and reunions with the efficiency of a military campaign. The trip was taking on symbolic weight beyond visiting a dying grandmother. It felt like a pilgrimage to understand who they had been before America reshaped them. The Lagos airport was exactly as chaotic as Desmond's childhood memories suggested, but now he could appreciate the energy rather than feeling overwhelmed by it. Maya emerged from the international terminal, looking simultaneously excited and apprehensive, her academic confidence tempered by the reality of being the only non-African in their family group. Aduni hugged her tightly, and Desmond felt a familiar warmth at seeing two people he loved connecting naturally. The week in Lagos transformed all of them in different ways. Mama Nina, despite her illness, was sharp and funny, immediately adopting Maya as a granddaughter and peppering her with questions about American universities and British weather. Aduni spent hours sketching relatives and neighborhood scenes, her artistic eye capturing details that photographs couldn't preserve. Papa seemed to relax in ways Desmond hadn't witnessed in America, his Igbo flowing naturally as he reconnected with childhood friends. For Desmond, the trip was a revelation about identity and belonging. He found himself comfortable in Lagos in ways that surprised him, able to navigate markets and family gatherings with instincts he didn't know he possessed. Maya watched him with new appreciation, seeing him in his cultural context for the first time. On their last night, as they sat on the veranda where his grandmother told stories, Maya took his hand and said, "I understand you better now. Not just where you come from, but who you've always been." The flight back to America felt like returning to a different planet, but also like carrying Nigeria with them in new ways. Mama Nina had died peacefully 2 days after their departure, as if she had been waiting only to meet her American grandchildren. At her funeral, which they attended via video call, Desmond felt a completion he hadn't expected, a circle closing that allowed new circles to begin. He and Maya hadn't resolved their relationship during the trip, but they had rediscovered their friendship and mutual respect. Sometimes, Desmond thought, as their plane crossed the Atlantic, love transforms rather than simply ending, becoming something different but no less valuable than what it had been before.